Where would you put yourself from an economist viewpoint, like an Austrian economist view, and then maybe the opposite being a Keynesian kind of view? Where would you say? Are you somewhere in the middle? Would you consider yourself Austrian, Keynesian, or how do you think about that?
First of all, I'm not an economist.
I'm just talking about your view. I'm talking about your
There's
viewpoint,
that.
right?
Yeah.
I'm not an
And I
economist
think,
either, but I align
I've
with
been
the
accused
Austrians,
of,
but I'm not an economist either.
no, I think not being an economist is actually helpful because part of the problem is that you find yourself in a
Right.
box. I've been accused of being a Keynesian, a monetarist, an Austrian, a Marxist, pretty much anything around the spectrum. I would like to think of myself as just a realist. I started out with Austrian sympathies, hard money, gold standard, free market capitalism, and you just can't get over the history of what happens when you get into these deflationary depressions, which is the worst of the worst
Hmm.
case. So I disagree with most of what Keynes said about some of the implications and what government should do in the wake of deflationary crisis. But yet you can't argue with how Keynes framed at least the deflationary disease. He called it the worst evil there is because in a deflationary depression, the consequences of that deflationary depression fall mostly on workers. So the poorest members of society are the ones who suffer in these worst cases. So we have a very vested interest as a society and a system to make sure that we don't have deflationary depression. So if that makes me a monetarist, I don't care. If that makes me certainly not an Austrian, but if sympathies for some of these other schools and doctrines, I think most of them have at least some good ideas that you should listen to. But I really think part of the problem here is that everybody gets very rigidly doctrinaire and ideological and stops thinking about things in terms of evidence and actual history.
Yeah, just you had said that you do believe banks should be able to fail and wash out the bad ones and creative destruction. I agree with that. But then you talked about in a deflationary event that the good banks go out of business with the bad banks, and we just recently saw this in the crypto markets, right? Where we saw in 2008, obviously with the investment banks, and then recently in the crypto markets, and a lot of that is because of the contagion that's taken. So too much leverage built up in the system. The contagion because they're all doing loans with each other, and so when one goes down, then they lose those assets, and it dominoes the whole thing. And so it's the leverage that seems to be the problem. And so in a system where we didn't have all this in monetary inflation, and we didn't have all this leverage that built up, and we had banks that were on full reserve, for example, then those banks wouldn't go out of business. They wouldn't be subject to the mistakes that those
And you would never have economic growth.
because of the
You
inelasticity
would
of the money
constrain
supply.
the upside. Yeah, because that's the thing. I think that's the other part of this that we're forgetting is that we live in a dynamic world where demand for money is not static. Demand for money changes, and I'm talking about legitimate demand, not just speculative demand. Legitimate demand rises and falls, and we're supposed to be able to get a sense of that by the interest rates, for example. If there's legitimate demand for money, I know legitimate is a sort of a weasel word here. It's doing a lot of work, but legitimate demand for money goes up. Do we really want the price of money to skyrocket because it's fixed? If there's legitimate demand for money for legitimately productive and sustainable purposes, why wouldn't we want the dynamic money supply on the supply side to be able to meet that demand for money without causing frictions and harms and inefficiencies? So if you have a fixed money system where you don't dynamically meet demand, two things happen. One thing is you'll get lack of economic growth, and the second thing is the commercial system will invent new forms of money to circumvent the hard money cap, so to speak. This has happened throughout. I mean, the Eurodollar system itself was an answer to Triffin's paradox because Triffin's paradox wasn't really a paradox. It was simply the international reserve system under Bretton Woods was incapable of meeting rising global demand for money in a dynamic setting. So I don't agree that demand for money or the supply of money needs to be fixed in order to make sure that we don't ever have an asset bubble. Because like I said, I think business cycles happen anyway. They're going to happen regardless of whether or not there's fixed money or not. You saw that all throughout the 19th century on the best of the best, the classical gold standard. There were bubbles everywhere. It happens. It's a flaw in human nature, not in the monetary
Right,
system.
and I would agree with that. They happen, and that's a problem that we see all throughout the world today. For example, with look at the rise of antidepressants use, especially in the United States. For example, well, like you need, without we can't always just be happy 100% of the time. Like we have to have pain in order to know joy. For example, right? How do we know the happiest time of our life if we don't have sad times and things like that? And so a lot of that. But jumping back, staying on track here with the money supply. So, like with Bitcoin, you've mentioned many times, and I've seen your interviews with one of my good buddies, Robert Breedlove. And you mentioned now Bitcoin has some superior attributes, transparency, lack of asymmetry, things like that. But it's the inelasticity with that, because of Bitcoin, of course, has a fixed monetary supply and over more than 21 million. Then you think that leads us back into the Triffin's dilemma, paradox kind of a thing. And then back into some sort of a Eurodollar or some sort of a new emergence of a credit-based system?
Yeah, I think that's the primary drawback. You're right, because I think Bitcoin is an elegant idea, an elegant step in the right direction. Because one of the problems with the Eurodollar system is that it is a distributed ledger, virtual currency, digital currency technology, but it's maintained by just the banking system, and it's completely opaque. We don't really know what goes on inside of it, which has privileged the banks even that much more. An Austrian concept called Cantillon effects, which if you're able to create money if you're able to create money and nobody else is, you get the benefits first, which of course then leads to over financialization, if not hyper financialization, which we saw in the pre-crisis era. So Bitcoin in a lot of ways was a step in the right direction, certainly in terms of transparency, but also in terms of just simplicity. We don't need an overly complicated monetary system. In fact, we don't want an overly complicated monetary system, because money is supposed to be a commercial tool. It's not wealth. It's not anything else. It's supposed to allow a modern capitalist free market economy to do what it does best. And that's we focus on productive uses of our time. We're not hiring all sorts of accountants and lawyers and attorneys and banks to hedge our financial risk. We should not think about money whatsoever. It's one of those things you should just be in the back of your mind, and you never really have to never have to think much about it. And that's one of the problems with the system that we have, is we spend so much time talking about this stuff and worrying about this stuff and watching it go crazy, that we've kind of lost focus here on the real economy, which is what's supposed to happen.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
So Bitcoin, I think, represented at least a couple of good steps in the right direction. I worry, though, that it didn't take enough of them in the right direction, and it leaves us in the same sort of inherent flaws that we had before. And again, the inelasticity problem is that, yes, we're going to have pain. We're going to have business cycles. There's going to be good times and bad times, but there really is no reason for the bad times to be so bad that it endangers the long-run future, which is what we saw in the 1930s or in 1893. But we didn't see it in 1907 because there was elasticity in the banking system created by the banking system itself. So, yes, boom-bust cycles will happen, but we don't need to have the worst of the worst case be presented with the worst of the worst case when we do get into the bust part.
But if we hadn't built the money supply up so big, the boom wouldn't have gotten so big, and then it would have made the bust so bad. So if I'm walking on a 1-foot wall and I fall off, it's not that bad. If I'm walking on a 100-foot wall and I fall off, it's really bad. And so if we look at it from that perspective, so for example, the problem that we're in today, right? So the last couple of years, and to the point you're saying, I mean, this creation of the money supply, this increase in the money supply, the Fed Treasury stimulus over the last 2 years, I'm not going to dig into the intricacies of that, but we saw a 30% rise in stock market, home prices have doubled, et cetera, et cetera. And so the average person, if they don't participate in that, they get left behind. So I'm a contractor, I work on homes, and let's say that, I have all these jobs, and it's like, well, I need to take on these additional jobs. I need to hire more employees. I need to go finance more vehicles. I need to move into a new office to keep up with that demand. Now, I could choose not to, and I could just store my money, to your point, and not have to worry about it, which is, I agree, is the way it should be. But if I play that game, I'm just going to put my money in the bank and ignore it, and I'm not going to scale my business to keep up with demand, then I get left behind. So I'm forced to play that game, but then all of a sudden, let's just suck the money out of the system, and then everything crashes, and now I'm stuck with all these trucks and these extra buildings because I had played in that game. And so if we didn't have this boom that I was forced to play along with and keep up, and then the inevitable bust that now crushes me, It doesn't seem like the worst thing in the world. Now, we'd still have booms and busts, but they wouldn't be so massive, and I could just store my wealth.
But under the terms that you've dictated,
But
yes,
isn't that what's
that's
happened?
exactly true. But that's not that's not what actually happened. What actually happened was we had legitimate economic growth before the crisis showed up. Yes, there were bubbles, there were imbalances in certainly U.S. real estate, but you look around most of the rest of the world, emerging markets, China, for example, backwards communist subsistence agriculture China turned into a global powerhouse, which we all benefited from, by the way, in some ways, some people more than others. Obviously, it was at the expense of certain parts of the U.S. I grew up in the Rust Belt, so I knew exactly where all those jobs went. They certainly went to China. But by and large, the growth cycle, certainly from the 1980s forward, was a legitimate growth cycle. And I would make a strong case that that would never have happened in a restrained fixed money system. We never would have had that growth. And so it's difficult to prove the counterfactual that, hey, maybe we shouldn't have had that growth to begin with. I don't know. I think the world is a better place because of the globalization that certainly showed up from the 1950s forward. As soon as the Eurodollar started really producing, these virtual dollars in excess, that's really, I think there was a very real benefit to that. And had it not happened, the world would have looked very differently than it does today, or at least in 2008. And the problem was not that we printed money after the crisis, is that we didn't fix the monetary issue in 2008. We didn't create elasticity, and that has led to a permanent change, or at least so far a permanent change in economic growth, so that we are, over the last 15 years, we are seeing what the global economy would have looked like had it not had enough money. And it looks increasingly ugly by the year. There's a reason why we're witnessing social, political, and economic upheaval all over the world. It's because we're seeing what happens in an economic system that is deprived of any monetary elasticity.
Well, I certainly agree with that. I think a lot of the upheavals that we're having around the world is also because of other bad policies, such as restricting energy use and restricting food. But those are different topics for a different time. But sticking back on this topic of the inelasticity of the money supply, I would think that we'd both agree that we don't need money. Nobody wants money. What we want is the things that money buys us, which is back to the point we made, goods and services, right? That's what an economy makes, goods and services. So I don't want the money, I want the goods and services. Now, I would ask people typically when they say, well, doesn't the money supply always need to increase or expand? I would say, wouldn't you rather, and to the point that you made, which I agree with 100%, like a brain surgeon, the world blew up into prosperity because of specialization, right? And now I could be the best brain surgeon. I could focus on brain surgery, and I should just focus on curing cancer or whatever that is, finding perpetual energy, focus on that, and then my money should just go sit, and I shouldn't have to think about it. To the point that you made, I agree. And so then I would just ask the average person, would you rather your money that you've saved today buy you more goods and services in the future or less? And I think everybody agrees they would want their money to buy them more goods and services, not less. But through an inflationary system, the money continues to buy us less and less goods and services. And so if we look at what we really want as goods and services, the money is a proxy of that, so a medium of exchange for that. So we have all the wealth of the world, all the goods and services of the world divided by the money. And if we're trying to keep the money at one, then all the value goes to the goods and services, so everything gets more expensive. But if we had a fixed money supply, then the value could accrue to the money and the goods and services would go down. Am I seeing that right? In theory.
In theory, yes. The problem is it leads to all these similar boom bust cycles.
But not if we don't.
Sure, it looks good in terms of prices, but what happens when everybody's thrown out of work? That's really the issue here, is that, yeah, okay, so my money buys me more on the other side of a crisis, but I also don't have a job today. So that's not a really good trade-off by any stretch of the imagination, particularly when those who are thrown out of the work are the most vulnerable in society. And you do that enough times, and then you end up with what we're seeing now, which is increasing discontent, extremism, and anarchy.
Okay, and to your point, we don't know. We don't have we don't have an A/B test to really run. Although we do have 5,000 years of history without a fiat money system, so we do kind of have that. And to your point, there are booms and busts because cycles change, creative destruction happens, but we don't have the massive amount of misallocation that we would have today. But again, we don't really have that. I guess what I would say then is, what problems would a Bitcoin underwritten capital market need to solve in order to be viable in your mind?
Well, first of all, it has to have a wide enough base so it's wide enough. It could be used in a widespread. It needs to be. That's really what a global reserve currency is. And that's what we're talking about, right, Mark? You look at it, Bitcoin, not just for a niche use. You want it to be a medium of exchange, not just a store of value, but a useful medium of exchange that can be used in enough places that it becomes a useful medium of exchange. So it's sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy there. That's what a global reserve currency actually means. It means it's available, freely usable, and widely used in as many places and as many circumstances as it could possibly do. And a fixed monetary system makes that incredibly difficult, especially when it's not widely distributed. And let's face it, money is always going to pool. It's always going to end up in fewer and fewer hands because that's how free market capitalism works. Successful people are going to end up with more money in their hands. And what ends up happening in that situation is you need some form of financialization to get that money moving back into the real economy. So you can't escape financialization unless you're willing to go back to a completely 100% commodity physically owned system, or the digital equivalent of that, which means you're actually reducing the potential of that economic system. So Bitcoin, I think, has a couple problems, including what happens when it's hoarded, as well as is there enough of it to be used in a widely used across enough places in the real economy. And of course, geography is another issue as well.
So a couple things. So one, to your point, sure, it has to be widely accepted, right? So money has to have a bunch of attributes, 5 of them that I really like to key on, but one of them, of course, is saleable, right? Recognizable. People have to be willing to take it. And so to your point today, right? I mean, it's very small, but we're a dozen years into it. So I believe money is like an evolution. If we look through the history of money, it's evolutionary, it's emergent, right? So we used rocks and feathers and seashells and all these things, but one emerged as the best because it had the best money properties. And so I think, there's like a store, like a collectible. Oh, this is kind of cool. Like I'll hang on to this feather, this rock. And then eventually maybe that collectible evolves into a store of value. So we see the wealth holding fine art and cars and things like that. But those don't have money attributes. And so maybe a store of value could then evolve to a medium of exchange. And I'm happy to admit that I don't think Bitcoin is the best medium of exchange today. It's certainly too volatile to be paying your bills with on a monthly basis, and it hasn't reached that wide scale adoption, to your point. So I think there's an evolutionary path, but it does have the attributes, I think, for it. The one thing I would just point out, and I'm sure you're probably aware, but one of the many things with Bitcoin is that it's the first asset, the first commodity that doesn't need debt to reach velocity. Right, so gold is very slow. Right, it's not portable. I can't send it to England very fast or over Zoom to you right now. And so we had to add the debt on top of it in order to get the velocity. But Bitcoin has velocity with a bearer instrument, which is pretty interesting. But anyway, so back to the question. So I guess you answered my question. So what it would need to solve was it would need to be more widely accepted, I guess was the point. More widely usable. And usable meaning more people are able to use it, right? It's friendly enough and easy enough.
Yeah, not just more people in all types of use cases.
Okay, got it. Yeah, okay, good. Now, let's jump back to the final discussion here that you had set up earlier. It wasn't on my list of questions, but you talked about, maybe, or I'm framing it up as this end game. So you said the yield curves are predicting that, there's probably one more pivot in front of us. That's where they're really worried. You had said that maybe there's a few rate hikes before something breaks. I don't know if you had said, or maybe this is where I think, but probably before the end of this year, we'll probably see that. Before something breaks and then they reverse course. We don't know what that is. We can only speculate. What do you think is the base case of speculation? I know we're only talking in terms of probabilities here. Credit markets dry up, or what do you see there?
Yeah, there's a lot of potential sparks or potential shocks that we could go through. I think we already did when oil prices skyrocketed in early March. I think that was the trigger for what we're seeing in terms of a base case recession. So the first half of the year, technical recession, as you said, Mark, that's completely a distraction. That's not really, markets are not worried about what's already happened. They're worried about what's coming next. And what's coming next looks like, okay, we start with a recession, but there are also any number of problems from geopolitics to money itself. A big part of the monetary system is repo and collateralized transactions and derivatives, things like currency swaps. And believe it or not, there's just not enough good quality collateral to go around. And so we get into these situations where dealers in particular become risk averse. Certain junk quality collateral becomes less negotiable. It acts every bit as if a monetary system was being tightened from the inside. And so I think one of the things that is forcing these curves to be as inverted as they are is concerns about a collateral run, as we saw in March of 2020 and again in 2007 and 2008, because we've been stuck in this collateral shortage situation for the last 15 years, and it has never really been handled. And it leaves the system, I mean the global financial system as well as the economy, in a precarious situation when it becomes, when we get into these risk-averse situations where collateral becomes scarce. So I think collateral shortages, which are prominent in every marketplace that we see, especially something like treasury bills, repo fails. And again, the U.S. dollar skyrocketing. Why is it going up? Because there's problems in the collateral system. That's part of what's going on. And then the other part of it is something like geopolitics. What if the Russians do turn off gas to Europe
Looks like
in
they
the
are.
wintertime? Yeah. What is that going to look like for the world? I mean, that's something that if I was, running a massive portfolio of hundreds and hundreds of billions, I would probably want to hedge against something like that happening. Or not just gas to Europe. How about food to the Middle East? I mean, so there's any number of real potential shocks that could make a already bad situation worse. And I think that's really the issue here, is that we're heading into the second half of this year, all sorts of potential concerns in front of us, and we're starting off the second half of the year on the wrong foot anyway. So, I mean, I can understand why curves are priced the way they are in ways that we haven't seen since 2008, because the risks as well as the reality are that unappealing.
Yeah. And you highlighted a number of those, and we have even more. There's all types of landmines out there that could blow up on us. So now I guess the last question we'll just kind of end it with, and this maybe is not a big one, but if the Fed has no control, the Eurodollar market is much bigger. Let's say that we have this, they end up with a few more rate hikes, they stop. We have any of these significant events that could happen, to the points you said with the food crisis, the energy crisis. Those are two big looming ones. Another potential pandemic lockdown that seems to be rearing its head again, potentially. Then the Fed would have to reverse its course and would try to do something, which to your point, maybe they can't. But if it was whatever, $700 billion in 2008, it was $6-7 trillion in 2020. I mean, is the next one 10-20 trillion? And will that have any effect? Can they even keep the bubble from deleveraging?
I think the next one is, I think that what the Fed will look at is not so much size, sort of take a playbook, because everybody follows the Bank of Japan anyway. I think what they do is they take a page out of Bank of Japan's book where they say, okay, we've bought treasuries, we've bought MBS in the past. That didn't really have much of an effect. Maybe this time we're going to actually buy corporate bonds. I know they pretended to in 2020. They didn't actually buy many. They'll actually buy corporate bonds. They'll start buying ETFs. They'll start buying different asset classes, because this is all about psychology. This is all about trying to shock the system in ways that the Fed wants the system to be shocked. So I think rather than seeing an increase in size of quantitative easing, you'll see like Japan, where they'll add to the target the list of targets for asset purchases.
Okay, all right, more strategic. All right. Well, Jeff, it's been an amazing interview.
Or just like Volcker, throwing something against the wall and hoping it works.
Well, man, there's so much more we could go on with, but we've gone super long. I appreciate you taking the time, and to everyone listening, we had some frustrations on my end on the recording, so I appreciate your patience with that, Jeff. I know you do the Eurodollar University podcast, which I listen to, and I recommend everybody check that out. We'll link to that below. MarketsInsiderPro.com and PortfolioShield.net, I believe, are two other projects you're working on. We'll link to those. Anything else that you want to call out?
I write at different places too, Real Clear Markets, Epic Times. So You can find the research anywhere around the research, writing, commentary.
Yeah,
all
you
over
are
the
all
internet.
over the internet right now, and it's never been more important to understand how that works.
From October 9th through 12th, I'm bringing together a group of roughly 40 serious investors and financial professionals, along with some special guests and friends like Hugh Hendry and Mike Green, George Gammon, Brent Johnson, and a couple of other ones, where we're going to spend 4 days asking the questions that truly matter. What happens next? Where are the biggest risks being mispriced? Where are the opportunities? What should change our minds? And how should we think about positioning around it? This is not a conference built around speeches. It's a small room built around discussion, some disagreement, and actionable advice. So if you manage some meaningful capital or you're seriously interested in all of these questions and finding answers to them in a very small, intimate setting, apply below.